Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to today's webinar on managing up, where we will actually be introducing a brand new course that we're adding to our library. Today's webinar is officially called Managing Up, Using Cultural Nuances to Understand Your Manager. We'll just be referring to it as Managing Up for the sake of not getting tongue-tied. But welcome, everybody, to today's webinar. We've got a lot of people registered for this, and several of them are logging in now. So I'm going to slowly ease into the introductions and so forth as we sort of get started today. We do have a lot of content to cover, so I think it's going to be pretty exciting in terms of where we how much we learn today. Really, the content will be very much geared, however, toward individuals, right, to learn and understand what those cultural differences may be with their managers and how to interpret those differences. But we will, of course, be showcasing the actual course itself at the very end of the webinar for those of you who are interested in that piece of it. If you are interested in getting trial access to this new course, feel free to write in to the questions box here on GoToWebinar, and we'll be happy to assist and reach out to you. If you're a client of Culture Wizard, as some of you are, and you want to add it to your library, just reach out either directly to me or to your client service manager. Now, you may be wondering, when I say directly to me, who am I? I am Jorge Vargas, Chief Revenue Officer here at RW3 Culture Wizard, and I am joined today by Mallory Matney, who's our Director of Global Client Service. So I'll let Mallory introduce herself for a second, and then we'll get moving.
Hello, everyone. It's kind of appropriate that we're talking about this today because I was just wondering, when do I jump in for Jorge speaking? So we'll talk about hierarchy later, but this is a perfect example of it, and I'm gonna file that away for later.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Um, all right. So let's, I moved forward without even meaning to, but I guess let's move forward to get into this webinar. We're going to just talk a little bit about housekeeping. They've changed their design, so I genuinely need to get a new screenshot of this, I believe. But the GoToWebinar platform fundamentally stayed the same, right? So it will default to computer audio. If you're having a hard time hearing, I do recommend you switch over to the phone audio instead. That tends to be a little bit higher quality. In addition to all of that, we do have this questions window. So in the questions window, you will be able to write in with questions, of course, or we've answered any questions that we throw out there as we get into this webinar. There is no chat feature enabled on these webinars. Of course, if you are a client of Culture Wizard and we're doing something customized for you, that's very different. We would open up the chat feature and so forth. But given the context of this particular session, we tend to do most of the talking just between you and us as the presenters. So feel free to use that questions box and we will reach out. This session is being recorded. So if you have to leave early for whatever reason, don't worry. We will be sending out the recording at the end of the webinar to everybody who attended, as well as to the people who did not. Right. So feel free to do what you got to do if that's the case. Okay. Let's get into a quick overview of who we are, and then we'll get right into the agenda. So very high level, for those of you who are not familiar, Culture Wizard helps companies to create strong, vibrant, and inclusive corporate cultures, corporate environments. And we do that using our online platform, which has a variety of different courses and assessments on items such as cross-cultural communication, global leadership, global inclusion, etc. We also provide instructor-led training on those same topics. We have sessions on everything from LGBTQ plus in the workplace down to communicating and working effectively with people from a specific country. Right, so it's very robust information. We also have a Culture Wizard mobile app, and we're always adding new courses. Right, we have something like over 50 to 60 courses at this point. And this new one kind of adds to that library, and it's going to add something that we didn't really have before, which is what we're excited about. And it's going to add this ability to use one of the most popular features of Culture Wizard, namely the Culture Calculator Teamwork tool, without actually having to have your manager complete the assessment. Right? And I'll explain a little bit of how the course came to be at the end when we're actually walking through it specifically. But before we get to that, let's actually get into the webinar for today. So first of all, we're going to start off with an understanding or discussion, right, on the cultural impact on workplace relationships, particularly with your managers. Then we're going to get into discussions of common cross-cultural challenges, and we'll specify specific behaviors and categories of behaviors that can be problematic when working with a manager. And lastly, we'll close out with some best practices, and then we'll go into the course itself. So, having said that, let's get started here. Okay. So let's start off by talking about culture itself. Right, culture is extremely complex, and I think that's almost goes without saying. But the reason for why it's so complex is that we have different layers to culture, right, and to the challenges that culture can bring about and the opportunities that it can bring about. Right, we talk about these layers. I always think about the movie Shrek, which I'm sure many of you have seen, right? Where Shrek is explaining how ogres are like onions. Culture is the same way, right? There's always different layers, and the topmost layer is in many ways the most visible, the most obvious, right? And it's geographical. What country are you from? What city are you from? What region, right? That's absolutely a big part of culture and what it's all about. But then when we're talking about uh, the workplace, right, there's another layer beneath that, and it's the corporate culture, right? Every organization has its own culture, its own way of doing things, right, and its own understanding of how business gets done and how people treat one another, etc. But then there's another layer beyond that, and that's each individual, right? And what created that person and how that person behaves and what was just intrinsic to that person, right? Behaviors that they were just born with. Right? Those of you who have young children, you know, or have had young children, you know that even at infancy, they start to have a little bit of a personality, right? Some babies may cry a lot, some won't. Some will be very brave about taking the first steps, some won't, right? Some will get a little nervous, a little anxious. All of that is part of that intrinsic culture. And the individual has a whole other layer to them, right? Because they also have the extrinsic culture. It's all the culture that's kind of given to us in childhood, right? And as we go through life, things like education, right? Your educational level, but also the educational level of your parents, of your family, right? The language that you speak. There have been countless studies that show that the language that you speak really dictates the way that you see the world in significant ways, right? And that's why people who speak more than two languages, more than one language rather, they have a distinct advantage, right? Because they can see the world in different ways, right? It's because of the way that their brain is wired, especially if they acquired those languages early on. Um, your family, and I'm not just talking about your family structure, but even just the specific members of your family, right? All of that's going to have an impact. Your generation, right? We're always, it's very popular every 5 years or so to start complaining about the latest generational group. And right now, Gen Z is getting a lot of heat, and everyone has something to say about it. But it will repeat itself again with Generation Alpha, and it will repeat itself again with the generation that comes after it, and so forth until the end of time. But it is true, although the criticisms are not warranted ever, it is true that every generation has its own specific traits because they live through different things, right? And today, for instance, today is a somber day in the U.S. and I imagine in other parts of the world. Today is the 11th of September, right? And we actually went back and forth a lot as a company deciding, do we want to do this webinar today or not? And for those of us who lived it, especially those of us who were younger, right, and kind of grew up with it, it has a specific kind of relevance, and it has a different kind of relevance for the people who were adults and lived it, right? Whereas for the younger generations who weren't even born, it's something out of a textbook, right? That's also going to feed a little bit of what that culture is all about and how they're made up, right? And lastly, of course, religion, right? Religion is always going to play a role in creating culture and influencing others, even if the person's not actually a practitioner. And there's many, many other components to an individual's culture. So when you add all these things together, you really do get into a kind of an onion-like situation where you have to really be an expert at understanding how culture impacts behavior. And the other reason for why you have to be such an expert at understanding how culture impacts behavior is because now many of us, and I know there's a push to return to work, but now many of us are working virtually, right? And when we work virtually, there's less opportunities for small talk. You don't see each other face to face. You It becomes much harder to create relationships. It becomes harder to establish trust in many ways. There's a lot of risks of miscommunication, and what you're seeing here on the screen, right, is actually results from our 2022 global virtual work study that we conducted, where we asked over a few thousand respondents actually for how they perceive the impact of virtual work, right, and where they were finding the challenges. These have only grown over time, right, especially when you have younger generations entering the workforce that they never even were in an office, right, and so for them it's all new, it's all different, right. So this does kind of become accelerated in many ways in terms of the impact that it has on individuals. And for those of you, of course, who are new to Culture Wizard, we publish studies all the time. So if you're ever interested, just go to our site and you'll find our white papers and so forth through the site, and you can download them, of course, because we're always conducting this kind of research, right? So we've got culture. Culture is very complex. We've got the added wrinkle of working virtually. And now we have the fact that managers are different, right? Managers will have their own styles. They are individuals and they are complex. And if you're working for a manager who you do not understand, if you're working for a manager who you do not connect with in a significant way or in a positive way, let's put it that way, then what ends up happening is all of your communications, all of your touch points, eventually they start to sour a little bit, right? Because maybe you didn't have a chance to build trust because maybe they build trust in a different way. So trust isn't really there. Maybe because of that lack of trust, you're not, I mean, maybe actually feeding into that, you're not communicating well because maybe you're a direct communicator and they're indirect. So you're not understanding their feedback. You're not, when they're sending you a supportive message, you're not picking up on it at all. When they're giving you a criticism, you're not seeing it. And so you're continuing with the behavior, which then creates more conflict. Right? And eventually you end up in a situation where you're not engaged. You end up in a situation where you don't care, right? There's apathy. And eventually that leads to resentment, right? And I'm not talking about resentment toward the manager. I mean, certainly there would be that, right, in these kinds of situations, but resentment even toward the whole organization. And once you get to that point, you want to leave. Um, and if you've never been in a situation like that, or if you've never heard of anyone who's in a situation like that, please write that into the questions box because I want to know uh, who you are and what companies you've worked at, what company you're at now, right? Because that's pretty amazing. Everyone at some point or another goes through this pattern. Doesn't mean you're going through it now, but it certainly happened, right? And that's why it's so important for all of us to have these skills, and it's so important to provide this kind of training for your employees because the end result of this, right, is that people leave, right? And if they don't leave with their feet, they will leave with their minds and with their heart, right? And they won't they'll be going through the motions. And that takes a lot longer for a company to figure out if someone's just sort of phoning it in, as we say. Um, and that becomes a real challenge uh, going forward, right? Because it ends up hurting the company's efficiency and the company's output in the long run if you have these kinds of problems. So it's so important to get these cultural differences out of the way. It doesn't mean, by the way, this doesn't give a blank check to managers. They can do whatever they want because the employee is going to have to figure them out, right? The managers still have to sort of change their behaviors a little bit too, but that's not quite what this particular webinar is about, right? We'll do another webinar on that part later this year, and we've certainly done that before, but that's not quite what we're going to focus on today, although of course that goes without saying, right? But I did just want to make that point in case anyone was going to walk away saying Jorge thinks managers can do whatever they want. So Where does that leave us? How do you manage up? The easy answer, of course, is you do that by applying what we call a global mindset. A global mindset has many different components and many different ways of being referred to, right? But and you'll hear names like global agility, cultural awareness, empathy, inclusive leadership, etc. And some of these are one for one synonyms, others are very related to it. But essentially, a global mindset is really about having an openness to diverse thoughts and perspectives and other and ideas beyond how you work, and more importantly, having a willingness to adapt to those different environments. Right, that's fundamentally what it is. On this next slide, we're going to speak to it again. Right, is this willingness to embrace international work and embrace working globally, etc. That's the formal definition. I actually I prefer one that's a little bit and this is the definition that we use, but I kind of I always in my sessions I usually use a different one, um, which is that a global mindset is the ability to reflexively adjust your style based on the behaviors that you're observing. So in other words, if you are observing that the person across from you is an indirect communicator, you have the ability to, and you are not an indirect communicator, you have the ability to shift a little bit how you work with this person because you know they just need a slightly different type of communication style. That's a global mindset, right? And it requires two things. It requires one, being able to identify the behaviors that you're seeing, and it also requires being able to shift the way that you do things. And that's not easy, right? It sounds really simple, like, oh, okay, I'll just be more indirect. But that's not actually that simple. Most people don't really know how to do that, and it takes a lot of practice, right? So, and we'll get to that a little bit in some of these later slides and how we can do that. The reason, part of the reason too, for why it's difficult, not just to change your behavior, but also to identify the behavior in front of you and understand it for what it is that our brains are really bad at it. So we have um, this great ability to keep ourselves alive, right? And that ability is that our brains will identify different behaviors and will immediately pick up on patterns and will decide, this is a good thing for me or this is a bad thing for me. It's a very basic way of looking at the world, but it's how the whole front half of our brain, sorry, it's how the whole back half of our work primarily works, right? That's what you're seeing here on the screen. It's that sort of reptilian mind, right, that sees fire and knows immediately fire is bad. You should run from fire. Right? You don't have to stop and think about it. In a more modern setting, it sees a car swerving quickly in front of you, and you have to react. You have to slam on the brakes. You have to swerve. You have to speed up to get in front of it. You have to blow your horn. You have to do something, right? It's great. It's very useful in a situation like you're driving really fast or you're driving and the person in front of you quickly cuts you off or something like that. It's amazing in those situations. It's typically, unless you're a race car driver, it's typically useless in a typical professional setting, right? And so that's where you really want to focus much more on your front brain thinking, which is much more about logic. It's about controlling emotions, memory, and so forth, right? And really just using information. Now I'm planting the seeds of this here for just a moment. We're gonna get back to this kind of at the very end of the webinar, but it's important to remember this because this is actually what makes it so that if you see a particular behavior in front of you, you may misinterpret it because this back brain thinking is exactly where bias lives, cultural bias specifically being the subject of today, right? And that's how you misinterpret behaviors because you see something and your brain has the patterns, and so your brain immediately thinks, oh, right, if someone acts in this particular way, it means that they're not a particularly good person because they're judging me, or they are saying they're being nasty, right, toward me. They're being disrespectful toward me. And you may just not be picking up on the fact that the person is providing you a very direct feedback, right? But you're interpreting it as an attack because that's not how you operate and it's not how you grew up. It's not what you're used to, right? And that's very much, and it's not something you think about consciously. It just sort of happens, right? So very important to keep that in mind. Okay, I'm going to speed us along a little bit. Like I said, we got a lot to cover here. So we're going to talk about cultural values, of course, right, and what helps you become more self-aware, right, and what you can draw from in order to do that. So different parts of your personality, experiences, right, all these things that give you all of this sort of back brain thinking, they also are what help you break out of it, right, because you can lean on these things and understand both yourself, but also the people across from you. To really understand yourself, though, you need to be able to think about culture not as what we saw here, right? All these different things that kind of get jumbled up, but as behaviors. That's how we talk about it at Culture Wizard. We talk about culture as being behaviors, right? And we specifically focus on 8: hierarchy, group orientation, relationship, communication, time, formality, change, and motivation, right? And on the screen here, you have on the right hand side, you have the the descriptions of each, right? A very, very high level, of course. Descriptions of each, right? Group is all about how you make decisions. Relationships are all about how you build trust, etc. And the way that we do that here at Culture Wizard, the way that we help you measure this in yourself, is we actually provide the culture calculator, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. It's an assessment. It's 40 questions long and allows you to understand where you are in each one of these dimensions, and then compare yourself whether to your colleagues or to different countries. We have 175 in our library, right? And you can see the averages and how you compare and all these great things. And that's kind of the starting off point for talking about managing up, because when it comes to working with your managers, some of these traits are more important than others. I'm going to leave this up here for just a minute while I kind of talk about some of the traits that we're going to get into, and Mallory's going to walk us through some of them first. Um, but we're going to focus quite a bit on hierarchy, right? Hierarchy is all about how you view power and how you view authority. So it's tied up with management any way you like, any way you slice it. We're going to talk about relationships, right? The creation of trust. We're going to talk about communication style. We're going to talk about time, right? Because your sense of time will dictate your relationship with your manager. And we're going to talk a little bit about group orientation as well, because it all has to do with decision making. And your manager's decision making style is very important, right? So the way that this course was created was that we would allow the individual to take the culture calculator first, so that as they go into the course, they understand a little bit about themselves, right? Who am I in this conversation? Because that's the first step in attaining a global mindset. Is not, you're sitting across the table from someone and you immediately can read them like a book and you know everything about their behavior, and you modify and act and so forth. It's actually understanding who you are first, right? Because how do you modify if you don't know who you are, right? You may think that you are very direct because in your family, in your city, in your country, you may be a very direct person, but it turns out that on average, people where you live are not actually all that direct. So although you might be the most direct of them, you're not actually a very direct person at all when you communicate, right? And suddenly you land in a country that is very direct, like the Netherlands, right? Where on average people can be very forthcoming with their opinions and their feedback, or even the U.S., right, where people have a different way of being direct, but it still comes out, right, in conversation, and you realize like, whoa, I'm not ready for this kind of feedback, right? I feel like I'm being attacked. So it's important to understand where you are first, right? And that's what we do with the learners. We show them first their results, and then we get into the conversation and we start to focus on which traits matter most with their managers. And as I said, we're going to focus a lot on the traits that impact communication styles, the creation of trust, and which impact a manager's individual style, right? Individual leadership style. So that's what we're going to really focus on. And I'm going to pass it off to Mallory, and she's going to walk us through relationships, which is all about the creation of trust. So, Mallory, I cede the floor.
Thank you, Jorge. So relationships, as Jorge kind of mentioned, it's a dimension that speaks to an individual's belief, trust and friendship in business, and appropriate ways in which we relate to one another. So interpersonal oriented people are coming from a place of I'm making a conscious effort to get to know you as a human outside of the work that we're doing. So this is actually pretty common in a lot of cultures around the world. In Britain, for example, it's common for the first 5 minutes of a meeting to be unofficially the time for small talk before the real agenda begins. And on the other side, we have transactional perspective. So let's get straight into the agenda for today. In this example here, what comes straight from our new course, you can see where you land compared to your manager. So what happens if your manager is more transactional than you? Maybe you sense some impatience. Maybe they're thinking, when I asked, how are you? I didn't expect such a long response. It can feel a little bit abrupt, like your manager is disinterested in getting to know you or disinterested in trying to understand the team dynamics. But what you can do is try to determine where their boundaries are and recognize where you need to respect those. So, kind of as it says here, you can frame issues or questions in terms of productivity, in terms of timelines, in terms of retentions. It's almost like learning your manager's language. Once you understand the lens from which they operate, you can apply what you're learning to what you're trying to communicate through that lens. So rather than looking at it through the perspective of your own cultural norms, which may be that you need some more warming up before getting to the agenda, you can look at that part as not something negative, but rather something that is not applicable to your manager. So part of the relationship dimension has to do with trust, which we can talk about a little bit more now. We have a kind of a metaphor for what trust entails. Peach culture tends to be open to chatting about light topics like the weather, your weekend. It's usually as a means to indicate friendliness, trustworthiness, lightness. But where the trust ends is when topics go any deeper than that. So you think of a peach that's easy to cut through until you get to a pit where you can't go any further. I'm thinking more generally of American, British, Australian norms. Coconut, on the other hand, tends to be more reserved, but once you're in for a long time. You have to really work to gain trust over a long period of time, but then once the trust is built, it's like a coconut. There's a hard shell, but there are no barriers once you are in. So cultures that I would generally think of, maybe Polish cultures or like that. So going into the peach culture, we recommend enjoy their friendliness and their willingness to welcome you. Don't be offended if the conversation is not personal, it doesn't dive too deep. Learn to make small talks. In the peach culture, small talk is a way to break the ice. It's to encourage a sense of trustworthiness. So ask questions that encourage that easy conversation. Maybe answer some small talk questions in a way that's general, not too deep. Spend some time getting to know the other person so that you can talk about what it is that they are trying to bring up. In a coconut culture, we recommend patience. We recommend accepting that it will take time before they open up a little bit. So adjust your expectations for how long it might take to establish trust and build that relationship. Observe practice observing those around you to learn which questions and topics of conversations are considered appropriate. So it's kind of like learning where the boundaries are. You see where you have to go, and if there's you can kind of see on someone's face, you can kind of sense when things have come to a stop, then you can pivot and move somewhere else. So wait to ask personal questions until people from the coconut culture bringing up the topic themselves. So another common way of looking at trust is looking at it in terms of results-oriented trust and relationship-oriented trust. Results-oriented trust or cultures, and they need trust to be earned. So what are the proven facts, figures, results? How many years of expertise do you have? Proof through numbers. Can I trust you enough? Then I can trust you enough to be friendly, basically. Where relationship-oriented trust starts with knowing someone who knows someone who can verify that you are trustworthy. So someone I trust says that you know what you're doing. So now we can work together and we can address the facts and figures with more transparency because now that I know I can trust you. because someone has vouched for you. There's no right or wrong way to build trust, but diversifying how you come to a trusting working relationships is one of the key ways that you can manage up. Once you understand how your manager prefers to build trust, you can proceed with either presenting facts and figures to demonstrate expertise, or you can find allies who can kind of vouch for your trustworthiness. You can find people who are willing to uh, co- corroborate what you're trying to say. That might mean more coming to your manager. So it's important to practice both types of methods so that you can more easily switch when necessary. And now we have a special feature of myself and Jorge. So say we are talking about me and Jorge here, who's listed as a bit more transactional. So as his direct report, what I need from him is a little bit of warm up on our one-on-ones, nothing too long or nothing too drawn out, just a simple hi, how was your weekend? Is it still raining in London? Yes. Something to show that he's acknowledging me as a human and I'm not just a cog in the machine. And at the same time, if I want to keep his attention, I need to get straight to the point. So here's the issue. Here's the facts that he's going to ask me about, the numbers, the data, the metrics, the dates. And by having these prepared ahead of time, then we can kind of meet in the middle. But Jorge, I'm curious if you have anything to add here.
It's really funny. This morning I walked. I like this truly just happened 45 minutes ago. Right. I walk up to somebody on the team, and I asked her. I just kind of went. I said, "Hey," and I went right into the conversation. And she's newer, and I realized like, oh no, 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 that was way too much. So I immediately had to, because I started asking her. I was like, hey, so what? Just remind me again. What are you working on today? Because I had this thing that I wanted you to work on instead, but I just want to make sure before I move around your whole day. And as I was wrapping up that sentence, I realized like I went way too fast here. So I slowed down and I said, actually, hold on. How are you? How was your commute? How was your day yesterday, etc., and just kind of slowed myself down. So you're absolutely right, Mallory. I do very much just like to get right to the point. And those of you even who've worked with me as clients or partners who are on the call, you may have noticed that I have that tendency. It's just kind of how I am. But most of the time, I'm conscious enough to stop myself and ask those sort of follow-up questions. But yes, it does. I mean, it does help, right? As a manager, if the person who's reporting to you understands that and can change their behavior a little bit as well and recognize like, okay, yeah, I can, we'll meet in the middle, right? But eventually you do have to also have the information ready because ultimately it's not really about, at least for me, right, the way that I operate, it's not really about the relationship so much as, we're here to do a job. And that's something I've absolutely said many times before, but again, I'm aware of the fact that I may not be the norm. So that's what it is. But yeah, it's a great example, and this is really how it's meant to be used, right? This course, and your manager may not have taken the culture calculator, so it may not have the results here visible, and that's why it's so important to be able to just understand their behaviors, and the course prompts that a little bit. We'll see that in a moment. But anyway, Mallory, I'm rambling now, so I'll pass it back to you.
No, no worries at all. Um, so one of the big things when we talk about managers and managing up is hierarchy. Hierarchy gets tricky when it comes to managing your manager because depending on your cultural norms, there are a lot of different unspoken rules that may or may not apply. A hierarchical manager might say, okay, any key decisions need to be approved by me first. It comes through me. An egalitarian manager might say, I don't know, what do you think? Let's talk about it a little bit more if you disagree with me. And one of the things that's also interesting about hierarchy in terms of managers is the idea of interruptions. If your boss is going on and on and on, is it okay to interrupt? If they interrupt you, is it okay to say something? In hierarchical cultures, the answer would be no. Interrupting would be seen as
Mhm.
disrespectful. Better to wait until the end of their spiel, or send them a private message with your contributions or with any suggestions that you have. But in egalitarian cultures, your manager may assume that if you have something to say, you will interject. So I have an example of a hierarchical versus egalitarian manager relationship. I'll just speak to really quickly. So I once knew someone who would get very frustrated with her manager because of differences in hierarchy. She would go to her manager with these issues and then come out twice as frustrated. Why isn't she telling me what to do? Why doesn't she fix this issue? She just keeps asking me what I think, but she's supposed to know what to do. She's the boss. So this colleague is hierarchical, and she expected a manager who would be the final decision maker, who would be authoritative and clear. And in some ways, it can be a relief for people to kind of have someone of authority to back them up if something goes wrong. But depending on your own cultural values, you could perceive a hierarchical manager as a micromanager or someone who's, controlling. But even the concept of managing up, manager, an egalitarian might see this as a collaborative type of leadership, whereas a hierarchical might question whether, a hierarchical employee, that is, might question whether having to manage your manager means that they know what they're doing or wondering whether they know what they're doing. So it's something to think about when we look at hierarchy and egalitarianism, is that there's two completely different ways of perspectives of expectations of what it means to be a manager. So in this example here, you can manage your more hierarchical manager by being more deferential in your communication, checking in when there's a decision that needs to be made by them, and making sure that if you have any differing perspectives or opinions, that you kind of bring those up as recommendations where appropriate, but also be prepared to offer the details and the facts and other metrics to back them up before coming to them with this. Jorge, I'm curious again what you think about this. If
You
there's
know,
anything.
that's those absolutely. Those are my results there, right? So I am typically very, very egalitarian in the workplace in terms of just how I view things. I mean, I don't really care what someone's job title is. If they've got the right idea, let's do it. Um, the I don't interrupt people though, or at least I try not to. So that one, I will say, but and I hate being interrupted. So maybe I'm more hierarchical than I think. But there is a challenge, right? When you are managing folks who are more hierarchical than you, because and it's not just about conversation, but it's also about or you can also see it in situations where you give instructions, right? And Mallory's example kind of hinted at this, where you give example or you give instructions on something that you need your team to do. You may realize that they there'll be kind of like a moment of paralysis where they won't really show the initiative or they won't own the challenge or the problem that you need solved, and it kind of feels like they're waiting around for you to come in and make the decision, right? That's how it feels, at least for an egalitarian leader, when someone's waiting for them to make the decision every time. And so that's the situation where both sides do really need to have a conversation and a coming together moment. And again, managers too, right? So if you're leading a team and you're listening, it's not, again, it's absolutely not a situation where you just need to put your feet up and wait for them to figure you out. You need to figure out your team, right? That's what a good manager does, what a leader does. You need to figure out your team, and what they're all about, and how you would manage that person, and how you give instructions, and you need to say like, hey, if I ask you to do something, you're not clear on what it is, or you feel like you're not empowered to do that, just tell me. And maybe it's true they're not empowered. Maybe you're asking them to go and request things of people who are way above them in the organization, and at that point, yes, you do need to open up some doors for them, right? Absolutely. But you also need to to show them in that situation, right, where you're egalitarian and they're not. You need to free them up a little bit, right, and show them how to do that. Show them how they can take control of a situation, right? And it does require a lot of training. Sometimes it requires a lot of focus, and some people are have more challenges than others. But ultimately, everyone can do it. It's just a matter of preparing your people and really showing them how. Right. So I'm going to then take it on now to, or move forward here to the next dimension, which is your group dimension. And group dimension is an interesting one, right? Because it's all about how you make your decisions. Um, how you make your decisions and how you move forward, right? Who do you include in the conversation? Um, Individualistic leaders typically will not seek out the input of others, or will not necessarily look for buy-in, right? That's really what it comes down to. Do you need buy-in from others? They may be much more prone to saying, you know what, let's just, I hear you, right? I hear all your opinions, and we're just going to do it my way, and that's just what it is. Whereas a group-oriented manager, they may be looking to make decisions that are more beneficial for everyone and make sure that everyone's on board, right? So it's up to you to kind of evaluate your own, and that's what the course does, right? Is evaluate your managers and try to understand how they operate, and then go ahead and maybe modify as needed, right? Your behavior, or at least be mentally prepared for this is how decisions will work around here. And that's a decision, right, for yourself. Is that something that you're comfortable with, or is that something that you want to maybe have a conversation about, right? And try to figure that out. And we'll get to how you have those conversations in the next slide when we talk about communication. But the next piece, of course, is time. Time's kind of an obvious one in many ways, right? Because if you're very, especially if you're fluid in time and your manager is very, very, very controlled, then time is pretty obvious. Because if you're always late for things, if you're always behind schedule, and your manager doesn't like that, you're going to know about it, and you're going to know about it pretty quickly, right? So that's why we include this one. But honestly, to me, of all of them, this is the easiest one to understand. Um, right? And it cuts the other way as well. So what happens if you are very controlled of your sense of time and your manager is kind of all over the place when it comes to time? And I am like that. I mean, I'm not all over the place, but I am much more fluid than the average person in the US, right? So that becomes a challenge for me sometimes. And I try to ground myself a little bit, and I use calendars and stuff. But I have found that the people who are on my team, that I'll find that sometimes they kind of set the deadlines for me. So they'll say like, "Hey, so we need this," right? And that's absolutely an example of them managing up, right? Because they're managing me a little bit in that situation, and I see it. And Mallory, I think this is the first time I'm seeing it out loud. So feel free to tell the rest of the team I am aware of it. But I'll notice when people are kind of saying to me like, "Okay, so this needs to happen by the 30th. So maybe if you could um, make a decision or get me that signed agreement or whatever it is by this, then I can go in and do the rest of it." And I hear that, right? And so it's like, okay, great. And I'm actually very grateful when that happens, because that helps me then understand what is their timeline and what do I need to do. And usually when I see them doing that, I'll realize like, oh, okay, if they're doing this, it's because this is genuinely an important thing to be doing. So I'll usually focus on it more and actually speed up the process if I can. Right. But it's good, right, to have that awareness sometimes. Right. I rarely have the challenge where I am more controlled and the other person's more fluid. Um, I have had, however, when I've with managers of my own, I have had that, and I found that I do the same thing, right? Or I've had to do the same thing where I will kind of manage their calendar a little bit, and it does sort of point them in the right direction, right? And it, with some managers it works, and with others it doesn't. And when it doesn't, you have to find other ways of doing that. But that's still the way to do it, right? I find another way that works is you build in some buffer time. If you know that your manager is always going to be delayed, you build in some buffer and you say, hey. And I've seen people do this before with other leaders. Um, and now that I think about it, I've had to do it myself. If you need something by the 30th, you tell them it's actually due by the 20th, right? And that does work. Obviously, it's not the best approach because you're kind of being a little deceptive, but sometimes you really just kind of need to do it, right? So anyway, that's the time dimension. It's a fun one because it really fluctuates so much with people. And then, of course, all of this is about communication and communication styles, right? So I'll um, I'll kind of give you an example from both sides when it comes to communication, right? So I do have moments where I can be very direct and very blunt. And I find that when I'm working with other leaders, right, within the organization, I find that sometimes I can be the scary one, and so I have to kind of dial it down. I have to go into the conversation just knowing, like, okay, you need, like, this is who you're talking to, and you don't want to step on people's toes. You want to take it easy, so you need to, whenever I open up my mouth to speak, I have to just stop and say to myself, like, okay, like maybe just phrase that differently. Um, right. And other times, if I really just need to have the effect of it, go for it. It's fine. But always be aware of what you're saying, what you're doing, the potential actions, right? Especially if you're dealing with a leader, with a manager in your organization. Uh, I've also found, right, on the other side, I've had sometimes people on the team who not just here at RW3 Culture Wizard, but at other companies where I've worked, right, or companies even that I founded. I'll have employees who will be very, very direct and very blunt to the point where it almost does feel a little rude. And so in those situations, I, as a manager, will sometimes kind of say to them, like just kind of find a casual way to say, like, hey, everyone's got their own style, but sometimes, especially if you're working with a client, you're going to want to moderate a little bit the way in which you phrase things, right? It's not even about tone, it's just the way in which you phrase things. Like, maybe just add in some more, like, more words, right? Don't just stick to yes and no, because sometimes very direct communicators, will just be very yes and no about things, and they're not adding in a lot of context. So maybe just focus on adding in some context. It helps, right? You may find that there was something you were missing in the conversation by doing that. So that's from a manager's perspective, that's a way to handle those differences. When you're dealing with someone who's indirect, right? The challenge really just becomes you have to watch their body language a lot. And even little things, if it's your manager, if you just notice little things like emails, right? And who's getting put in what order in an email, pay attention to that, right? And just notice if there's a pattern to it or if it's completely random. If there's a pattern to it, maybe that says something, right? And maybe that does communicate some degree of how confident they are in the people of their team and things like that, right? And just focus on those things and address them, right? If it's possible, right? It really depends at that point on the individual manager. So that's a little bit on communication. Now, we've given Mallory and I have given some ideas on how at the tactical level you can address these changes, these differences with your manager. But let's get into the slightly more strategic level, and then we'll get into the new course, right? As we're pretty much at the end here of today's webinar. Remember how I talked at the very beginning about back brain and front brain thinking, and the back brain, of course, is that more reptilian part of your mind that allows you to really understand, or sorry, that doesn't allow you to understand anything. It just reacts to things. And that's really the part of your brain that when you get feedback from a manager, or you notice that they're just making all the decisions by themselves and so forth, you may think like, wow, this person's a real jerk, or this guy doesn't care about anyone's opinions except for his own. And you might be right, by the way. You might be completely right. So I want to be clear about that part. But you don't necessarily want to just take that and run with it, right? You want to shift your thinking to the front part of the brain. And how do you do that? The first step is you pause. You just stop. Whatever it is that you're thinking, just stop for a minute and kind of give yourself a moment to breathe. Then evaluate the behaviors that you're seeing, right? They're never including me on decisions. They're never communicating their thinking, that sort of thing. Evaluate what you're seeing. Then reflect a little bit and think of why that might be happening. Maybe I'm misreading it. Maybe they are communicating the decisions. I'm just not picking up on it because they're not a very direct communicator. Maybe it is happening, or maybe it's buried in an email somewhere, or maybe it's not their decision. Maybe it's someone else's decision, right? Everyone has a boss, right? So maybe it's not actually their decision. It would still be nice if they brought you into that, but that could explain some of it, right? Or at least why they're not changing based on the input that you're providing. And then based on that, you might then decide to take an appropriate action, right? And of course, that appropriate action in this example is your opinion of this manager, right? Maybe you do decide after all of that, you may decide that you were right, the person doesn't care what you think and they're a jerk. But you may also decide actually there's some extenuating circumstances here, and maybe this is a good moment for me to show how well I understand the situation, how well I've read the room, and go up to the manager and say, hey, I know you're getting some pressure from elsewhere in the organization. How can I help? Right? Anyone who can come with a statement like that, that's someone who's going places, right? And so you want to just read the room a little bit, or again, you may find that there's nothing to read. What you see is what you get, and this person just doesn't care about people's opinions. That's a whole other problem, right? But most of the time, you will find there's something else, some other factor going on when you're seeing different behaviors, and so that's the pause reflect model. It's very much about slowing down your thinking and evaluating and using real information before you make an opinion. And having said that, I'm going to now go into the platform. If anyone, as we jump into that, if anyone does have any questions, we've gotten a few and we've tried to answer them as we've gone along here. But if anyone has any other questions, feel free to write those in. That's my email. Of course, you can always email me if you have any others or if you want access to the platform. But having said that, let me jump on over to the course that I've got open here, the Managing Up course. I've already opened it. I've already taken the culture calculator. Again, that assessment that shows you your own cultural profile. And here we have the beginning of that course, right? Where we're going to, the way that we build out your manager's behavior is we're actually going to give a quick scenario, right? So how do they typically make decisions? And then based on your observations, right, you're going to go in, put in the result, and you'll get your uh, output, right, so to speak, the recommendations of things for you to consider with the manager's results here and your own, right, as well, right. So that's me, and that's this manager based on the decision that I just gave. I think I just randomly selected B, right, and we go on for all the other dimensions and kind of build out this profile. And at the end, there's a little PDF, actually not so little, it's like 5 pages long, with recommendations that are geared for helping out with any cross-cultural differences you might have with your manager. And I mentioned at the very beginning that I was going to explain how this course came to be and why we're so confident that it's going to be really powerful for many employees. It actually came about as a client request. I will not name the client, but the client did say to us, our 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 people love the culture calculator, absolutely love it. And they love the teamwork tool, right? The part of the culture calculator that lets you compare yourself to others. Love it. They swear by it. But what they really want to do is they want to understand their managers. And unfortunately, our managers and our leaders, they don't feel like they have anything to learn from not just from us, but from a lot of stuff, right? They don't take the courses. They just assume this is for junior people, and they move on with their day. So they haven't taken, most of them, right? Haven't taken the culture calculator and these other assessments. Can you build us a course where you don't need the managers to take the assessment for them, for the employees to still have some input and some advice and some recommendations? And that's where the course came from, because we looked at our client roster and we thought about it, and we realized actually a lot of companies operate this way, right? And just from a couple of comments that just came in, I can see that we're not the only ones who've seen this, right? It's just the way that the things are sometimes, and managers just will oftentimes either be too busy or will think, you know what, I already know all this, I don't need to focus on it, and so they will skip past a lot of trainings unless they're absolutely required, right, for certifications or things like that. So this course was created, right, to meet that need, and that's why we're very proud of it. And we're really hoping that if you don't have access to it yet, you do reach out to us, and we'll happily help you out and provide access to you so you can view it and decide if it's something you want to add into your library. If anyone does have any questions or comments. I did one more kind of came in about the course itself, asking if we can integrate this course into an LMS using single sign-on or SCORM API, and the answer is yes, we can. So that's easy for us to do. So if you are interested in adding this course to your existing library, or if you're a Culture Wizard client and you want to add it, just write that into the questions window and we'll happily reach out to you and set up a call. Otherwise, unless there's anything else, I'm not seeing any new questions coming in. Unless there's anything else, we're so happy that you were able to join us. Our next webinar is next week on Wednesday, not Thursday, on Wednesday at 10 a.m. US time, which is, sorry, US Eastern time, which is when this call began. And it'll be on the topic of, of corporate culture and preparing for the future, right, and changes within corporate culture. We'll have a couple of special speakers on that one as well. So hoping that you'll be able to join us. And in the meantime, thank you all so much for joining today. And yeah, a few of you are asking for access to the platform so you can see this course. So feel free to reach out, and we'll also give you access, of course. Someone just asked, to the culture calculator assessment that's also included in the trial access. So feel free to reach out. Otherwise, Mallory, thank you so much for your time today. And everybody, thank you so much for joining. And we'll see you next week. All right, bye, everybody.